Well, thank you all very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure and honor. I've spoken at SciCon in Washington a few times, but never here in Tallinn. It's great to be back here. I spent a lot of time here when I was the U.S. European Command J5 back in the 2010, 11, 12 timeframe. I should give a little bit of background on the Solarium, I think, for this audience. It was a 3-year effort started by my boss at the time, Senator John McCain. It was a 3-year effort to strengthen our cybersecurity policy and laws in the United States. He set up a small group with 4 congressmen, 2 senators, 2 representatives, 4 cabinet-level officials from the government, 6 private sector leaders, and myself as the executive director. And we tackled a number of organizational issues inside our U.S. government. We ended up passing about 50 laws to try to improve our cybersecurity and about 20 presidential executive actions to try to improve cybersecurity. I wouldn't claim that the United States is cyber resilient or secure yet, but I think we're much more secure because of the efforts of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. As we began to wind down, and all commissions should wind down, at the 3-year point, Senator King asked us to create a non-governmental organization to keep tackling it. So Senator King, Representative Mike Gallagher, myself, and 4 other people have set up a team of researchers that are looking at the issues we couldn't fix during the commission. Principally, we're going through every U.S. critical infrastructure sector like water, maritime, transportation, security, healthcare, everyone that we thought was very weak. We're studying and coming up with legislative remedies. But we also wanted to take a look at a couple cyber force issues. One is we're actually studying the need for a cyber force in the United States. Should we replace the individual services with one cyber force? That will not be met with a lot of love inside our military. And the other is a partner capacity building effort, which I'm going to talk to here. And this comes mostly, Senator King and I were closely involved in 2017 and 2018 in providing Ukraine with about $50 million worth of cybersecurity capacity building money that I think was consequential in the last year. And part of that was we recognized that we did that because Ukraine had a very aggressive and effective representative in Washington, a guy named Georgy Dubinitsky, who many of you may have met if you work with the Ukrainians now. He's a deputy minister of cybersecurity for them. But he also asked us to help with cyber offensive capabilities, something we didn't do, and something I'll talk about during this. So getting into the brief, I'll say that my assessment, and speaking of Ukraine, our assessment is that since the war began, Ukraine has sustained thousands of cyber attacks, but they've been able to withstand these attacks because we believe that the Ukrainians spent the better part of the last half decade building their cyber defenses, and they often did it in partnership with the United States and other international countries. And as the world has witnessed over the past year, improving the overall capacity of an ally or partner like Ukraine to prevent, mitigate, and recover from cyber attacks actually enhances U.S. and European economic stability and national security. Because of strong Ukrainian defensive actions, Russian cyber attacks have not caused the kind of spillover into Europe and America that occurred when the Russian NotPetya malware, which was intended for Ukrainian financial systems, cascaded around the world in 2017. So in this paper that I'm workshopping here, we enumerate and analyze the U.S. government's cyber defense capacity building programs. We have them in both defense, like Department of Defense Cyber Command, and non-defense, like State Department, Department of Homeland Security, Treasury, Justice, many other agencies. But we're also going to look at what our allies and partners are doing and what the private sector is doing. The report then tries to demystify what offensive cyber operations are and how and when this might be appropriate as something you would train allies and partners on to improve their offensive cyber capabilities. The report concludes with a succinct call to action for an organized, prioritized, and resource effort to help embattled democratic U.S. allies and partners improve their cyber resilience and protect themselves in cyberspace. Look, the Biden administration's new national cybersecurity strategy argues for, says that a prosperous future is dependent on resilient digital infrastructure both in the United States and in its democratic allies and partners. So a pillar of that strategy is about international strengthening, both in capacity building and cooperation. The U.S. Department of Defense just issued last week its 2023 defense cyber strategy. It's classified, but the unclassified leak that they did emphasized that it does talk about the need to build cyber resilience and work with our allies and partners. So very consistent with our national cyber strategy. So you have the government strategy and the Department of Defense's strategy kind of aligned on this. As I mentioned, we use a ton of federal agencies to provide capacity building: defense, state, energy, commerce, treasury, justice, homeland security, as well as our intelligence community. And the government has lots of programs in there, and they focus on everything from how to write a national strategy, how to teach investigators cyber forensics, how to train operators to find and evict malicious cyber actors from critical networks. And our private sector does a lot of the same work, and they, in addition, provide discounted and sometimes free cybersecurity services and workforce training. But I would say the U.S. government's efforts are only prioritized at a departmental level, very tactically. They're not organized strategically, they're not prioritized. So we don't necessarily protect our most vulnerable or at-risk allies and partners. And there isn't a strategic rationale for prioritization. So you'll hear from us a strong recommendation to fix this. So when I think about cybersecurity, I think about these kind of challenges. They're numerous. First is our adversaries, their efforts are expanding. You can think about Russia, where ransomware is back. And ransomware took a brief holiday, around February 24th of last year, but it's back. All the statistics show that in the last 6 months, it exceeds any 6-month period in 2021. When I think about Russian cyber activity, it's really about criminal behavior, espionage, and installing malware for future, bad actor usage. And they are skilled. Look, SolarWinds was a high-end penetration of our systems. They got into our supply chain. They were able to take command and control of significant cloud service providers and penetrate 10 federal agencies and probably thousands of US companies. That is not amateur work. And I think it's fair to say the Russians generally have malicious intent. I'll take that full stop. When I look at China, they've now built a cyber national mission force about 10 times the size of our cyber national mission force. They concentrate on IP theft. Although they're shifting to malware, a big discovery of that happened last week. We publicized that they had penetrated telecommunications and transportation systems in Guam and elsewhere throughout the United States. And then the third thing they do, and I'll attribute this to the Russians as well, is a pretty aggressive disinformation campaign. So that's Russia and China. Iran they generally use cyber as a tool of suppression, whether it's internally or externally against expatriates abroad. But they also use it for disruption against Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, are all known cases. And then finally, on the nation states, there's North Korea, which is basically a cyber criminal gang masquerading as a nation state. I think the latest reports are that 50% of the money for its nuclear weapons program comes from cyber activities, malicious cyber activities, either ransomware or theft. Then there's a whole bunch of criminals out there that are embedded, shielded by Russia and others. Some are operate independently from Russia. And as I said, ransomware is returned, cyber malicious activities returned. All of this is because, for years, cyber malicious activity was aimed at banks. That's where the money was. But ransomware and other activity has monetized data so that they can take they can lock down your business operations like they did in Colonial, stop you from being able to charge customers and therefore stop service. I think Colonial probably regrets how they handled that now, but at the time. Another thing they do is take control of your field operations, that data. They can also grab your PII, the customer's data that you hold, or they can even just grab your email and release embarrassing email. So in all those ways, they can monetize data. So that's a very That first bullet there, that's a very expansive way of saying the adversary efforts are expanding. And our job is to improve cyber resilience. From a totally selfish United States point of view, we want our allies and partners to be cyber resilient. We want them to have, resilient military mobility. In other words, we want their maritime, air, and rail systems to be functioning so that U.S. and allied forces can move across them in a combat action. We also want our allies and partners to have resilient national critical infrastructure so they can maintain their electrical power, their pipelines, their financial services, their water, to allow for economic productivity and allow our allies to use their tools of economic statecraft alongside the United States. And finally, we want our allies to be prepared for disinformation, to combat foreign disinformation during a crisis. And really, our current efforts are ad hoc. I mentioned them, all four of them there. We're not organized in a way. And then finally, I'll say, there's been a deliberate attempt to not think about offense. Look, it's uncomfortable to talk about our own offensive capabilities. It's even harder to talk about helping others in this. But in reality, I think very little is done here. Not much is being done behind the curtain, so to speak, in a classified way. And I think we need to talk about that. Finally, we need a new strategy. That strategy is really an opportunity to identify, align, prioritize, and resource our efforts. For the United States, the bulk of those efforts are about building partners. About building our partners' preventative capacities. We do them through through non-defense agencies. I've said their names a few times. But what we look at, how do you do information sharing? How do you encourage international cooperation, share that information, push technical information around? Our State Department does this, as does our Department of Homeland Security internationally. We also provide legal and policy advice on how to do like a national cyber strategy policy, how to write national cybercrime laws and regulations. State Department does this, Department of Justice does it. We also have a new bureau at State Department called the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Diplomacy. It also is charged with helping countries develop new cyber strategies right after they develop their own. They're gonna have to do that. But also they're supposed to work at international cybersecurity standard setting organizations, like the ITU, the ISSO, so that we countries who believe in transparency and freedom of law law-based organizations can work together to kind of minimize the impact of authoritarian countries in those organizations. And you saw some recent success at the World Intellectual Property Organization and at the ITU, where Russian and Chinese candidates were beaten by Singaporean and US candidates in those elections, which, although in neither case did especially in the case of the United States, I don't think the bureaucrat that won represents the United States, but she did represent a belief in a transparent rules-based order. We also have attachés in our embassies, and it's getting out of control. We have FBI cyber attachés. We have Department of Homeland Security attachés. We even have IRS starting to put out cyber attachés. I'm sure State Department's working hard to have a cyber-enabled person at every embassy soon. You're going to be attachéed up if you're a ally or partner in the United States. And then we're running training programs, like CISA runs industrial control system training programs for allies and partners, and incident response training. And the United States Secret Service, Department of Justice run investigations. I mean, this is a laundry list of a lot of efforts going on. Probably one of the most important ones is in cyber resilience, the last bullet, last words on the first one. That's where the money is. We put about $400 million a year into funding efforts to improve networks around the world, other countries' networks. USAID and state run this. That's going to be amplified by $100 million each of the next 5 years for secure and trusted information technology and communications. That came from our CHIPS Act. So that's quite a bit of money flowing into this effort. One without a lot of money, but a lot of support, or a lot of at least press, is our counter-ransomware, where our Treasury and Justice departments are running bilateral and multilateral ransomware task force with allies and partners, trying to share tools and techniques and information we have with each other. And we run a whole bunch of non-traditional areas, the clean network, the digital connectivity and cybersecurity partnerships, programs that existed for years that aren't purely cybersecurity, but where cybersecurity money could be there. And then we're starting to really ramp up our incident response and recovery assistance. The FBI and Secret Service are running forensics and forensics investigations. They also help countries ID vulnerabilities. So in Albania, after the Iranian attacks late last year, they were in there. And then probably most obviously, we run hunt forward operations. But and I'll talk about it a little more in the military area. But I'll tell you, they are a small part of our budget. They're a big part of our press, but a small part of our budget. One thing I will mention is a missing piece, and that's attribution. Look, the U.S. is terrible at attribution. We're slow. We don't have the exquisite intel and cyber that we do in anything else. So 2 good examples. When I was on active duty, I think I was working with Senator McCain at the time, we had a attack from Iran into Saudi Arabia Aramco with cruise missiles. We saw the launch a few seconds into it. A few minutes after the strike hit, the U.S. military was on CNN saying it was Iran. Similarly, Iran attacked Saudi Arabia with a cyber attack, and it took us 6 months to attribute it to Iran, even though it was kind of obvious who did it, who would gain the most from it, who had been working on this issue, who we'd caught in the networks previously. Our attribution on cyber is much slower. There's good reasons for that, and there's kind of lack of fortitude reasons for it, but together it's not helpful. The only thing slower than the United States attributing something to an adversary is if we try to get with an ally and have 2 democracies attribute something to an ally. That'll slow you down even more. The private sector, on the other hand, for whatever, especially if they have no business in the adversary country that they're about to label as the perpetrator, is very quick to name names. And we saw this in Ukraine with the attack on Viasat. Private sector was much quicker to name the aggressor. In the end, the U.S. needs to be a better attribution partner, and we need to be a little more consistent, because I think most of our allies think that there's probably properly, that there's a tiered level of who we share that attribution with. And if you're a Five Eyes country, you get a certain level. If you're a NATO country, you get another. And if you're a non-NATO partner, you get a third. I wouldn't argue against that thought. The other big area is in our military cyber capacity building programs. Look, it's separate but complementary to the federal civil agency programs. The DoD conducts an extensive, well-resourced cyber capacity building across a number of lines of effort. Military support programs is where the most money is. That's where geographic combatant commanders use their discretionary funds to help bring cyber training. The anchor point for that is a program called the State Partnership Program, developed 30 years ago to help former Warsaw Pact and former Soviet states transition out of where they were. It assigns a state, a U.S. state. We have 50 states and 4 or 5 territories that do this as well, but assigns one of them to each country. So here in the Baltics, I think Maryland is for Estonia. That's pretty good for cyber, by the way. I'll just say Maryland is where the National Security Agency is located. So reservists from the National Security Agency would preferentially be in the Maryland National Guard. So the Maryland National Guard has very good cyber capability. But also, I think, trying to remember, Michigan is for Latvia, Pennsylvania is for Lithuania, so good cyber states. But not every state has a cyber program. So I said there's 54. I don't want to get your geography messed up. There's 50 states, just remember that. But we have territories that have National Guard, so we have 54 of them. Only 20 of them have cyber programs. So if you're a state, and back when we aligned these were aligned on what state had a capability that a country, like say at the time the Czech Republic or Slovakia needed, or Slovenia, we would align a country with them, and it didn't necessarily immediately get you cyber. But the Geographic Combatant Commander, so in the case out here, U.S. European Command, coordinates that state partnership program and other capacity building efforts. That includes also the Marshall Center, which does policy and strategy education and training, including specific 3-week-long cybersecurity courses that have about 50 countries at them each year, so it's a pretty fulsome course. We also do Ministry of Defense Advisors programs. And of the 600 or so we've had here in Europe, a handful have been cybersecurity, so you can get expertise that way. But there is a crazy NATOism, right? When you're working to join NATO and going through the military action plan, you get all the capacity building you can help, to get you there, all the cyber capacity, but everything you need. The minute you accede to NATO, and you're now like target set number 1 for Russia, we cut off all capacity building, and we say you're on your own. And the vast majority of countries have been monkeying with all their numbers to make it look like they're spending more on defense than they really are to get across the finish line. I mean, I'm not telling any secrets here. I think everybody understands this. And then we're like, hey, by the way, you better spend a little bit more on cybersecurity because the Russians are coming for you, right? And so that's a time for the United States to kind of step in. And if we need proof of that, it's what we saw in Montenegro, North Macedonia, Albania. These countries are really under hard attack from Russia in the first 2 cases, Iran in the third. But that's that military-to-military support programs. The big one in the United States normally is foreign military financing. That's where the big bucks are, not in cyber, because foreign military financing, it's really good. Like, I want an infantry fighting vehicle, get some FMF, it'll help pay for it. I need a tank, I need even sometimes a plane, not an F-16, we're not selling those. But, FMF's where it's at. It's slow. It has personnel and training in it, but those are minor players in the FMF effort. But we have done FMF for Montenegro. I think we had a $6 million plan there. Czech Republic had about $10 million for a deployable cyber response center. And it funds a lot of the counter-Russian influence funds, which do a lot of cybersecurity work in a number of NATO countries. So the FMF has some in there, but not as, that's where the big dollars are, but not the big cyber dollars. And then, of course, there's like the flagship project, the one everybody knows, Cyber Command and Hunt Forward Operations. But it is small dollars. I think we spent $60 million last year, so probably 4 or 5% of what we spend on cyber capacity building. So it's not a big chunk. It's defensive cyber operators side by side with their host nation personnel. It can be a 5 to 30 person team. They can be there for a month, or we've had one extended one, recently in Ukraine that was more like 8 months, but they're usually a lot shorter than that. We've had 47 of them in the last 4 years total. 47 ever, and 20. That number goes up every month, but we'll just say from about a month and a half ago, 47 in 20 countries. They are limited. There is a limit on the bandwidth of this. By bandwidth, I mean the number of people available to do this kind of thing. So if we want to do more of it, we actually have to grow the cyber force, which is a whole nother discussion we're trying to have, which is why, by the way, we need a cyber force instead of individual services, but we could talk about. But look, these are not all selfless. We learn a lot in Hunt Forward Operations. We learn a lot about how the adversary operates when we watch them on our friends' network. And in fact, I think we uncovered a lot of the 2020 Iranian attack on our national election system during a Hunt Forward operation and one of our allies. So, we're not selfless here. We have selfish reasons for doing it. The fourth area here is one of the biggest ones, and one of the ones where NATO finally, you hear the word NATO finally stepping in, other than stopping cyber capacity building the minute you join. NATO steps in. That's military cyber exercises. The big Cybercom runs them for the U.S. We have something called Cyber Flag annually. I think we have about 8 or 10 countries at it. It's pretty high end, 250 people. It's mostly NATO countries, 1 or 2 Pacific countries. We do bilateral ones with select partners. So we do one with Israel called Cyberdome. And then NATO does them. NATO's imperial headquarters in Brussels does something called Cyber Coalition with 30 plus countries. They do coalition warrior interoperability exercises, which has some cyber in it. And then here at the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, they run lock shields and cross swords. Lock shields being more of a competition, I don't want to call it capture the flag, but a competition-based one, and cross swords being a red teaming one. So that is a lot of effort there going into exercises, and it's good to see. The final thing I have on here is bilateral security cooperation agreements. We do these usually it's a sensitive area. Like there's a country where we need that critical infrastructure to be functioning so we can operate across it, and it's under adversary attack. So we did one in Jordan. As many of you know, we have forces in Jordan that support our Syria operations. And then there's going to be one passed this year for Taiwan as well. And these provide training activities, joint operations that sound a lot like hunt forward operations, network cleansing so that we can operate cleanly across them. These are very select. They take up a lot of bandwidth. So we won't have 15 or 20 bilateral cyber cooperation agreements. I think we'll end up with, we have one headed towards 2, and we could have 3 or 4 eventually. So that's what we have in our military. But there are other things going on. I already gave NATO one nod. I'll give them another and say the 2 biggest efforts that we see out there in cyber capacity building outside the United States are in NATO and the EU. Since the Wales Summit, I think 2014, NATO's been working on this. Here at the CCDCOE, you actually have, in addition to the exercises I mentioned, which are high quality and large, they have a very aggressive education and training program that provides solutions for cyber defense. Really the best ones I've seen. So that's an excellent effort. The EU has increased funding 10 times over the last 10 years, which would sound pretty cool, except it's still just a fraction of what the US spends. So it's increased a lot relative to nothing, but it's working its way there. They started in law enforcement, they're working norms and standards, and we certainly appreciate what they're doing there. They run CyberNet, a group of experts that can help with things, but they still have quite a bit of work to go there, I think. And then Australia and Japan are running small bilateral work or multilateral work in the case of Japan. Australia bilateral throughout Southeast Asia. Japan multilateral inside ASEAN. Then the private sector. The private sector is interesting. They can provide technology and products that increase cyber resilience. They can provide the crucial components of resilience and redundancy, incident detection and response. And sometimes they'll provide it at a low cost when the reputational advantage is right. And the place you saw that was how much they stepped up in Ukraine, both pre-attack and post-attack. They did a lot of discovery and remediation of attacks. They've donated equipment and free product licenses to the Ukrainians. There's been a lot of work by the private sector. And some of the pre-work was paid for by USAID, but it was still done at reasonable cost that allowed significant improvements in the cyber resilience of Ukraine. So the role of the private sector is not to be understated. So when you look at everything I just described was defensive cyber capacity building. Lots of effort. It doesn't appear like it's focused. And maybe Russia focused it a little bit for Ukraine, but broadly, it's still really ad hoc and not prioritized. To use a US term, it needs to be wrangled, right? And brought into some kind of strict organization. And I think that wrangler, the cowboy who needs to do that, is State Department's new Cyber and Digital Policy Bureau under Ambassador Nate Fick. I just think they're the best one. They have a lot of the money, which is always important when you're organizing people. But they also have been told, in the national security strategy and in the national cybersecurity strategy that you're in charge of this. So to me, that's important. And so, to me, those are 2 really important areas for us to work at in defense, is to get that prioritized, identified, prioritized, and resourced. And that leaves me with the one other area that was sticking out there, and that was conceptualizing offensive cyber capacity building. I think we need to start thinking about this now so we're organized when it's time to start doing it. A country having an offensive cyber capability is clearly not a given. Only a small percentage of the countries that have defensive capabilities have offense. Some countries even, by choice, refrain from having it. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you think about NATO, there's a number of countries that refrain from having an air force, I think Estonia being one of them. NATO appreciates that. NATO doesn't need everybody to have their little boutique capability. They tend to be not cost effective. Certainly it would not be cost effective to have 30 or 31 now independent air forces, right? You just need 10 or 12 of the countries to put some good money into it. Everybody else can just give their planes to the Ukrainians. But you don't need that. And like I said, NATO would probably prefer fewer countries have these boutique capabilities. But in the end, a country may decide that they want offensive cyber operations as a necessary tool. And our current policy in NATO, I have to read this exactly because I get it wrong, is sovereign cyber effects provided voluntarily for all, known by the great nickname SCEPVA. There's nothing else like this, really. I guess unilateral strategic nuclear weapons are, in a way, a voluntary sovereign capability provided by the United States, France, and the UK. But fundamentally, this is different from any other warfighting domain. We like our weapon systems to be continuously integrated into our planning. But with SCEPVA, it doesn't really allow for that. It's not how the US fights. So this encourages countries like the US to maintain separate US-only warfighting plans, which I'm confident they do. But I don't think that contributes to NATO consistency. And inside NATO, I think it's fair to say that at least 5 countries state they have a capability: the US, the United Kingdom, France, Denmark, and Netherlands. I'm sure others do. And as we think about other countries getting it, I think that we do need to collaborate together to work to at least have a minimum understanding so that someone's offensive cyber capabilities, that a mistake or miscalculation that they do doesn't risk a wider conflict. In other words, everyone having this, providing it voluntarily, actually, I think introduces a lot of risk. And that gets into how offensive cyber capabilities are used. They're used to gain access, pursue adversaries, deliver effects, but really what we mean there is kind of gain situational awareness, counter an adversary, maybe impose a cost on an adversary. So in crisis management, you can shape their behavior. And then at a really high end, and probably maybe the United States and the United Kingdom do this, and that's about it, it's integrating them with traditional kinetic effects. We really have to think about how they're used and what happens when one of our allies or partners starts to think about it. And this isn't well researched. I think there's one very good article, or one very good book called No Shortcuts by Max Smeets out there. But I try to think of it this way. It's about forced generation and forced employment, and I break it up because I think one of them is going to happen a lot earlier than the other. So I'll explain what those are. Forced generation is the process where required forces are produced to provide an operational commander with a necessary capability. This is the U.S. military's absolute worst acronym. It's called DOPMILPF, right? Which is Doctrine, Organization, Training, Materiel, Leadership, Personnel, Facilities. Definitely our worst acronym. Max Smeets, in his book, actually is much slicker than the U.S. military. He has a very specific to offensive cyber description. He calls it PETIO, P-E-T-I-O, or Personnel, Exploits, Tools, Infrastructure, and Organization. I prefer his definition, but no one prefers either concept very much. What I mean by is no one is voluntarily working to build anyone's force generation capabilities. And there's a couple reasons for this. As I said, some states don't want it. Other states who might want it don't want a third country giving them that capability because they think they'll be compromised right from the get-go by that country that's helping them. And then the truth is, probably one of the only countries that could provide it in the alliance is the United States, and we don't have the bandwidth for it. We are not training enough of our own people, and we're certainly not training enough of our own people to the right level. So if I was a cybercom commander and somebody asked me to put some bandwidth against this, I'd say, can't do it. So that's a tough one. I've been thinking about it, though, and if we did have to do anything in this, it'd probably be in that personnel and training of the DOPMILPF or the PETIO. And I don't think you can help in tools and exploits and infrastructure, the kind of stuff Max talks about in his. I mean, I just think if we started to help someone build their own tools or explore exploits, we might feel that we're liable for any unintended consequences of the attacks they do once we've trained them. If we gave them tools, they might be compromised, which means we can't use them later on ourselves, or they can be compromised in a way that they come back against our own infrastructure. So I just think it's very unlikely you'll see that. So maybe in the personnel and training, and maybe really in just a train the trainer kind of format, you might see that. But that fourth generation capabilities, and let's be clear, inside NATO, if you took any other mission, like anti-armor, anti-submarine warfare, air-to-air combat, we would do both of them seamlessly, fourth generation force employment. But I'm saying in offensive cyber, I think we have to take that fourth generation off the table for a while. And that's going to leave us with force employment. That's the process of utilizing or sustaining a capability. It's the O in .mlpif for the O in PETIO. And the idea here is we could offer operational, legal, or intelligence practitioners to provide guidance. And we can provide guidance on due diligence, collateral damage, deconfliction, attribution, even targeting processes. It could be in classroom training, similar to what happens here at CCDCOE. It could be in tabletop exercises or exercises. To me, this is the much more likely avenue that you might see some kind of support. But I think, as I said, fourth generation, very unlikely. Force employment, possible. Look, that was a whirlwind of information I gave you. The United States has a robust, as I said, ad hoc program supporting the cyber capacity building needs of its allies and partners. It includes efforts across defense and non-defense agencies, gets into all the things I said, information sharing, education, training, investigations, incident response. But this is really coming at a time when our adversaries are getting better and better at this. And so we're really gonna have to think about how we organize ourselves to get the most bang for our buck, to use a US term, to make sure we're properly resourced and prioritized. So we came up with 8 recommendations. I'll go through them quickly since all of them have been kind of dealt with a little bit. We need to make allied and partner cybersecurity capacity building a key element of the new international cybersecurity strategy. So that strategy is due in December of this year. Look, the most important thing is that the State Department can't write a strategy about the State Department. It needs to be, and they need to ensure it examines more than State Department equities. They need to align and prioritize the whole administration's efforts across all the defense and non-defense agencies. And I'll tell you, the number one opponent to this will be the Department of Defense, which doesn't like the Department of State telling them the sun came up in the morning, much less how to organize and strategize things. Look, it's got to recognize cyber command's important, and unforward operations are the coin of the realm in terms of what people like to get. But it needs to broadly prioritize and strategize all of those elements across, and then it needs to understand what our international partners are doing. There's no reason to replicate what's being done here at CCDCOE, right? We don't, if it's being done here, acknowledge that and move on. If the private sector is doing something, acknowledge that and move on. We don't have near enough resources to be duplicative, but we are. Our second big effort is prioritize building allied and partner cyber resilience in critical infrastructure. This is from a US perspective. We're a good ally, we're helpful, we're not selfless. We do things for a reason. And we need our allies and partners to be cyber resilient in their critical infrastructure. We need to make sure, as I said, that we have military mobility through the port, rail, and air systems. We need to make sure that the national critical infrastructure, the energy, the water, the pipelines, they're functioning, the financial services in the country. And we need to make sure that disinformation isn't grabbing hold in our allies and partners. Part of this is going to be resources. So recommendation 3 is provide additional funding towards Cyber Command, State, FBI, Energy, DHS. There's very specific recommendations in there. The biggest one in that's going to be Cyber Command. We've got to figure out how to get them more bandwidth. And that's going to be hard. Next one is conducting more bilateral, multilateral cyber exercises. I gave you a few examples of a really robust program, but I think we could probably do them within the Abraham Accord signatures for us, deepen their information sharing, because we now have a cybersecurity aspect to that. And we could probably also explore replicating the annual bilateral U.S.-Israeli and expand our efforts with Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, bilaterally in all those cases. I do think we need to expand or create new intelligence and attribution-related training activities. Probably starts with us telling people, please believe us, you're not in the lowest level of information sharing. We're trying to work with you on this. But look, I think some of our allies and partners lack the intelligence capabilities and cyber forensic skills to determine attribution, but they have the source of the attack on their networks. So we need to work with them, give new training capabilities to help allies and partners understand how we reach a decision about attribution, no matter how slow it is, at both the technical and policy levels, and help them develop their own domestic capabilities. 6, we need to practice select uses of bilateral MOUs. Again, as I said, we have ones with Jordan, about to have one with Taiwan. I don't think there'll be that many more. We need to assess future elements of offensive cyber force generation. I acknowledged, I don't think we're gonna do force generation soon. There's little appetite to build partner capacity to generate forces. But I do think it would be useful exercise for the Department of Defense to pick a military service to conduct a study on how to best address building or supporting a partner's ability to conduct force generation for that offensive cyber capability and determine the resources it would require and where you would prioritize them. As I said, I think personnel and training. But we should at least know, we shouldn't leave it an unknown unknown. I recognize that we don't know when we're ever gonna need that, but once we need it, we'll wanna know how much it costs and how long it'll take. And finally, I do think we should be developing offensive cyber employment training capabilities, offering operational intelligence and legal practitioners who can provide cyber-specific guidance on basic cyber operational issues. And within NATO, I think we could, possibly leverage this with existing training efforts on defensive cyber capacity building here at the CCD-COE. But that would be a big decision by NATO to begin offering that kind of training. And if they won't, then the US can do it alone. So that's a lot of things out there. In my mind, this is something the United States has to get its hands around. We need a single leader on this. I think it's, as I said, Ambassador Fick, the head of the State Department Bureau on Cyber and Digital Policy. But I think it takes all of our resources, defense and non-defense, and those of our international partners, particularly NATO, and the private sector companies that have been helping. But we know we can be successful, because if we learn something in Ukraine, it's that working on cyber resilience left of boom gives you a lot more agility right of boom. So I'm really hoping that something can be done on this cyber capacity building. With that said, I've left about 15 minutes for questions and answers if anybody has any. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi there, Gavin Wild, Carnegie Endowment. I'm curious, you touched on the idea of the fact that additional funding towards capacity at non-military entities. What would you say to your former counterparts within the DoD to kind of break, as you well know, the funding under DoD auspices dwarfs by orders of magnitude a lot of the funding that goes towards state FBI and other non-military entities. What do you say to folks on the Hill or within the current ranks at DoD to try to help break that dynamic and put more of that non-offensive, non-military cyber capacity building in the hands of those who can use it?
Well, that's a good question. So first, a couple things. The facts are changing slightly over the last couple of years. And I think, I'll say, stepping back, our commission had a lot to do with this, but the US government actually now spends $13 billion a year on non-defense cyber and $13.5 billion on DoD cyber. So they've actually become pretty close. And in fact, in cyber capacity building, I would argue that the non-defense spending is more than defense spending right now. But what you really need is, how do you convince congressional committees that Department of Energy international cyber capacity building is a national security effort worthy of their limited funding? And I agree that this is going to be challenging, much more challenging in the non-armed services appropriations committee. In other words, talking to Ken Calvert or Susan Collins, the Senate and House appropriators, we'd say we're doing this so that we can have military mobility. I got it, and the money will be there. When you go to the appropriators for the other committees, it's harder. And this will be harder But we used to say we would never get them in balance in their domestic spending, and we did. So I think we can make this argument, but you have to make the argument and understand there are things in here. We do not want the Department of Defense training non-DOD. In fact, we have some laws on this, training non-DOD people in foreign countries on how to do things, because sometimes those non-DOD people, especially in quasi and or non-democracies, use the tools we give them for ill. So we've been very careful to try not to have the DOD, which is not in a position to kind of assess that risk, that responsibility. So that's generally how I think I'd go about it. Say, look, this is inherently an energy, Department of Homeland Security, State Department, Treasury, Department of Justice responsibility. They know the actors in these countries. They've worked with them for years. They need more money for this. And I do think they need more money for that. I would say the biggest one is a conundrum at Cyber Command. They need more money for Hunt Forward operations, but if we tripled their Hunt Forward operations money, that wouldn't triple the number of people available to do Hunt Forward things, which is the real kneecapper on this, right? Which is if you do that, you're pulling them off the teams that are, I'll just say, looking, studying Russian rail systems for other reasons, right? Or studying Chinese air and maritime ports for other reasons, right? You'd be pulling them from higher priority missions to do Hunt Forward operations. So we actually need to build capacity in Cyber Command. You do that with more forces given to the Cyber National Mission Force. That number's been static for 12 years. I'm getting into the politics of the U.S. government or the U.S. Department of Defense here, but I'll just say, that's going to be a hard sell. So we've really got to work hard on the argument you're talking about, which is how do you convince them. But I would say things have gotten better over the last 3 to 4 years in these appropriations committees. They recognize cybersecurity as a national security issue. So I think we'll get more money. Now, look, I say that while they're about to sign a deal freezing all money. So cybersecurity is nonpartisan, but it is subject to the broader rules of the Congress, which is if no bills are passing, cybersecurity bills don't pass, and if there's no growth in appropriations, cybersecurity appropriations won't grow. So I think that's the strong argument we have to have, but you've hit on something that's going to be a very hard thing for us. Thanks. Any other? Yes, sir.
Michael Kuiper worked for Vista and trains NATO countries at cyber. What role do you think contractors have in building this force capacity?
Well, I refer back to my last comment about Cyber Command having no bandwidth, and I'll say a big role. Because when the geographic combatant commander is looking, that state partner program works 40% of the time. And even then, I should be careful. Some state partners have a cyber capability in the state's guard, but they don't have a cyber capacity building capability, which means they don't have people who are training people for doing this mission. So even when I say 20, it's less. So the absolute people who fill that gap are contracting forces, are contractors. I just don't think there's a sufficient bandwidth of service retained forces to do this, or state partnership program forces. So you're going to have to use somebody else. I have no problem with that. No one's operating on system. No one's doing offensive operations here. This is all defensive cyber capacity building. I think that's an absolutely appropriate use of contractors. Any other questions? Yeah. We'll go there and then there.
Hello. Jason Keller. I am the program manager for USAID's Digital Apex program, which is actually just getting started in some of our capacity building efforts for nation states. What kind of discussions have you had, and what do you think is ideal time frame for some of these engagements working with nations? And do you think that some of the senior officials that you're engaging with see the opportunities of cybersecurity being able to help improve governance kind of across the board due to, encouraging interagency processes, et cetera?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned AID. When to save on acronyms, I did not say state slant USAID, but most of the funding goes actually through an AID vehicle. When I said there was really big money, the really big money, the $450 million a year that goes into emerging technology kind of things, that's actually an AID fund that goes to different bureaus, mostly Europe and Asia. You know, on the question of when to engage, look, I gave one good example. When a country accedes to NATO, and I think Finland's exempt from this, they're a different kind of a session. But when I say, you know, the newest entrants to NATO are the ones that I'd be doing the most work with. The newest non-Finnish entrants to NATO are the ones I'd be doing the most work with. And if Sweden accedes, I'd put them right next to Finland on the you don't need our money. I don't even think they qualify for our money based on where they are in the OECD. But in any case, you know, I'd be in those countries helping. They're vulnerable. They're probably struggling with their defense budgets. And the Russians are running rampant, rapacious disinformation campaigns throughout their country and trying to mess with their elections. So that's how I do it. I think you're absolutely right. One of the things we have to communicate to our ally and partners, this isn't just about the military. You know, in the United States, I just gave you two good numbers. Our .gov is about 13 billion, and our .mil is about 13.5 million. There's another number for .ic, and they get some of the .mil, and then they have another number that we can't see. But, you know, we're pretty balanced in this. And then, of course, we have probably the most egregious case of like 85% of our national critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector or state and local governments. I think we're probably the most open that way. But many of our allies and partners are equally open, where private sector companies control large swaths of national critical infrastructure. So that's another thing we have to work with these allies and partners on, is how do you bring them in to this fold. So I think it's very important that you emphasize that interagency process. But I'd definitely be working over the most recent NATO members.
Arthur Nelson, Carnegie Endowment. I didn't hear cloud services mentioned in your presentation, and wondering if you could touch on that a little bit, particularly from the private sector standpoint. How do they get integrated into the strategic gap that you've identified?
All right. So I promised Senator King I wouldn't once again say out loud cloud services, that we should migrate as many people as possible to cloud services, and then we should heavily regulate the cloud service providers. Because 50% of that discussion, Microsoft and Amazon or Google are like, fantastic, migrate everybody here, and then what, regulation. But look, I think I think we should encourage our allies and partners when we're talking about how to protect critical infrastructure the same way we encourage our own small, medium-sized businesses, which is you need to get into a managed service provider network. There's no way your country, just like our country, has enough cyber workforce. The way to get around that problem is to go to a managed service provider who provides the majority of that workforce. It doesn't remove you from a responsibility to do cybersecurity, but it does take a lot off your plate. I also think our military has moved, and our intelligence community both moved to cloud service providing. We believe in this. Comma, asterisk. I think most foreign countries have a better ability to regulate things than we do. Democracy has its pluses and minuses, and it's very hard for us to pass regulatory laws right now. But I would say that cloud service providers are an important part of this. We should be pushing it, but people should understand there has to be a floor in that security. You can't just say, I'm going to the cloud, I'm okay. First of all, you have to continue to maintain some of your own basic cyber hygiene or data care. But in addition, when you choose that cloud, the cloud will have a rheostat, a selector. And over here is full security, which is expensive and inefficient. And all the way on the other end is low security, which is hyper efficient and cheap. And people will intrinsically pick cheap, efficient, and low security. And you have to make sure that when you're driving people to that cloud service environment, that you're also telling them you need to select some floor, some minimum level in that security. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexander Martin from The Record. There's a view that NATO members should focus on maintaining or developing complementary warfighting capabilities. What does that look like in the cyber domain?
Yeah. So I try to get at that. So first, you don't have the opportunity. When I say complementary, there's a couple of meanings to the word, like you do this and I'll do that. That's complementary. Or if you're doing it this way, I'll do it that way as well. In the defensive world, we all need to do it. No one gets a pass. Even the Portuguese, who look very far away from the fight, they still need to generate forces and then get them to an airport and get them flown out of Lisbon or wherever, right? So everyone has to have their cyber resilience of their critical infrastructure. They need complementary in the sense that we're maintaining to the same standard, so that we're able to move forces reasonably across. For me, this is like, if I know Germany's spending a lot more money on defense. If I had my dream for a day, I wouldn't have them buy more weapons that aren't always available for use because of rules of engagement issues. I would instead have them spend a lot of money on critical infrastructure and logistics, right, so that they can do that. So I'd be pushing that. So my complementary is that, you need to have the cybersecurity, defensive cybersecurity, consistent with what your mission in NATO is. And I consider Germany the logistician of NATO, right? They're the place, almost everything has to flow into them and through them and out of them to get into combat. So that's critical. And the complementary on the offense, that's exactly what it is. Again, we don't need 31 boutique offensive cyber no one wants, however many NATO countries there are, numbers of offensive cyber, assuming Sweden joins soon, whatever it is, we don't need that many offensive cyber capabilities. We need a handful. And if someone's going to join that group, we need to make sure, that's where the complementarity comes in, that how they employ their force, that force employment, is that we're training on it together, so we have a consistent set of rules about collateral damage, about reasonable risk to a tool, things like that. Thanks. Got 3 minutes. I got time for one more question, or we can just wrap. Okay, well, thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it. I'll be here for a few days if you have any questions, or if you read the paper and say that was completely crazy. And certainly if you see something you think is missing, I'd be very interested in your input. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.